You're listening to a free audio download from Venue Cymru's International Concert Series.
Welcome to the November edition of pre-concert interviews from Venue Cymru. This month at Venue Cymru, the Warsaw Philharmonic Orchestra, under the direction of Antoni Wit, performed Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto. Before the concert, Robyn, Paige and I caught up with Mendelssohn expert Thomas Schmidt to discuss the Violin Concerto.
Mendelssohn took quite a long time over the composition of what is actually the second violin concerto. If I'm right, it's 7 years, in fact. So firstly,
right.
Why do you think it took so long to complete? And is this common for Mendelssohn in particular?
Yes, it is. I mean, let's start with the second half. I mean, Mendelssohn was an awfully self-critical composer, and so he could never leave well enough alone. And he actually said once, I have to make a piece as good as I can possibly make it, and only then kind of let it out into the world. And so 7 years for Mendelssohn is about par for the course. For example, the Scottish Symphony started that in 1829 and finished it in 1842. Oh. And the Elijah, actually the first ideas for that were from 1836, 1837, and then that was finished in 1846 and reworked again in a year afterwards. So it's all... it's always an ongoing process, and so the flip side of that coin for Mendelssohn was once it had been performed, and especially once it had been published, that was it. He never went back to it, but that meant, of course, that for performance and publication, he had to get it absolutely right. And the Violin Concerto, in that sense, is a perfectly normal instance of Mendelssohn just labouring and agonising over his works.
Now, the Mendelssohn Concerto has always been very popular with audiences, it seems. Has it been popular since the premiere, or is it just a later day thing, like the Beethoven Concerto was? You know, it took a while for people to really to get to know the piece and had to be almost revived by some of the virtuosos later in the 19th century. What about the Mendelssohn Concerto?
I mean, that was popular pretty much straight away. It was, it was one of those things, it's like the Elijah, which also was the second big oratorio. It was something that people had been eagerly awaiting. I mean, you have to keep in mind that Mendelssohn in the early to mid-1840s was Germany's most famous composer. I mean, Wagner was only just getting famous, and he was an opera composer, so that was different. So he was famous in a different arena, if you will, and so Mendelssohn writing a violin concerto was an event on a national scale almost, and so people, yes, they went immediately, and the popularity never really went away.
And is there a reason, do you think, for the popularity to remain throughout to today? It's always on, I'm sure, once a day you get a nice listening on Classic FM. So why now is it still?
Well, I mean, it's a fantastic piece. I mean, but I think there's lots of things about the Violin Concerto which make it appealing. It makes it appealing to players, makes it appealing to audiences. There's of course this fantastic lyricism. I mean, when the piece starts, I mean, the violinist starts straight away after 2 bars of introduction by the orchestra, which is quite unusual. I mean, the audience in the 1840s would have expected sort of 2-3 minutes of an introduction, and then the soloist would come in. So there's and then the soloist comes in with this fantastic melody that soars about the orchestra, and I think there's something that spoke to audiences then and speaks to audiences now about this. I mean, the lyricism, the vitality of the piece also. And really kind of effortlessness of the piece, which completely belies the 7 years of hard graft that lie underneath. So it sounds like it's written on the spur of a moment. It sounds completely as in one go, which is fascinating. And another thing, I mean, something that I suspect makes it very popular with the soloists, I mean, it allows the soloists to shine, and it allows the soloists to shine in a way that is, perhaps technically more doable than, they say, the Sibelius, which also allows the soloists to shine, but I mean, they have to work years to actually be able to play it. So,
I would say, as a violinist myself, there's always something else. If you just were to play through from the beginning, there's always something new, a new theme or a new way of doing something to keep you interested all the time. Yeah. Whereas perhaps some of the other concertos, you've got lots and lots of scales and arpeggios and things to do all the time. So perhaps it's not quite as monotonous learning from, at least.
Yeah.
You talked about how the violin comes in with the solo straight away. Now it's not very common in many of the earlier concertos. Now, why do you think Mendelssohn sort of made these kind of innovations? Because I know that's not the only unusual feature that is in the in his concerto. Like you've got the Attica bonding between movements and things like that. Why do you think he did these? And can you say sort of express any other innovations that he did that make it different to ones in the past?
I think what Mendelssohn's all about in his instrumental music, or in his music in general, is coherence. He wants the piece to hang together. It's not about section, another section, or movement, but it's all, there are always very subtle ways in which things, and sometimes also very obvious ways in which things are linked. So, as you said, the movements are practically all linked together. And that was something that Mendelssohn was, it was very important to Mendelssohn, because he was also a conductor, and he was a music director at the Gewandhaus in Leipzig. And something that Mendelssohn was bothered by terribly was people applauding between movements, which at the time was actually completely common, standard. So it wasn't something. It wasn't like today when people applaud between audiences, and so 2/3 of the audience start hissing. So it's not. But Mendelssohn wasn't happy with that, and he said, because it's not three movements that are separate, it's three movements that belong together. And so if you break in between the concentration and the coherence and the wholeness of the thing gets lost. And so he tried to make sure, in his later pieces in particular. Scottish Symphony again is another example where it actually says on the score the movements have to be played without a break, and with the violin concerto also he's got the transitions, and so he tries to make sure, and the solos coming in right at the beginning, I suppose, is another instance of that. It's not about here's a chunk of orchestra. And then there's a chunk of the soloist, and then there's another chunk of the orchestra, and so on, sort of the Baroque model, ritornello, solo. But it's always the orchestra and the soloist together, which also means that the orchestra has more to do than in your standard virtuoso 19th century concerto. If you take, say, Chopin piano concertos, which are lovely pieces, but the orchestra isn't actually very important. It's about the soloist, isn't it? And although it's a fantastic piece for the soloist, the orchestra is equally as important as the soloist, and it's also great fun for the orchestra to play. And not only I'm a violist, so I could never aspire to play in the solo, but I've played in the orchestra a couple of times, and that was great. Not only because of Mendelssohn, but he writes so well for orchestra.
Yeah, now another development is a written out cadenza that, instead of coming in, say, just at the end of the movement as a last chance for the soloist to display their technical prowess. Instead, it's much earlier in the piece. Why do you think he wrote out the cadenza rather than letting the soloist do their own thing?
Because he was a control freak. Perhaps the short answer. It perhaps does go back to what I mentioned at the beginning, that he was agonizing over every little detail, every little note, and in the solos and also in the orchestra, he would change just little things, so a little transition here, bits in the accompaniment figures there, and so actually leaving it up to the soloist to play a cadenza. And at the time, often, soloists would either write their own cadenza or they would improvise cadenzas. I don't think Mendelssohn wanted to take that risk to let the piece out into the world and for the soloists to do with it what they wanted. Which, interestingly enough, although the 19th century is the big century of the virtuoso soloist, more and more composers do that. So you have the Beethoven is there's the cadenzas are still unwritten. Mozart, of course, the cadenzas are partly unwritten. He wrote some cadenzas for his piano concertos. All of a sudden, you get with Liszt and with there aren't really cadenzas anymore at all. It's written into the piece, And again, it's about this coherence, it's about this control, it's about this wholeness of the piece that he doesn't want to have broken by having just any old violinist have a go.
Do you think that these innovative sort of features of the piece have made a lasting effect on other composers that sort of followed Mendelssohn?
I think they have. I mean, he's perhaps not the only one, but he is certainly amongst the earliest composers who actually have this bringing together the three movements into one movement.
Yeah.
So, and that does become more and more common as the century moves along. Also, the way in which the three movements are linked thematically, or in which the way in which the material is linked within the movements. And I mean that's always, I think, I mean the party piece of the movement is in the last movement you have the first theme, which and then you have the second theme, and then in the recapitulation actually both themes are on top of one another. So it's actually the violinist, the soloist plays the first theme, and the orchestra plays the second theme, and all of a sudden you realize that they actually belong together. And that's, for example, that's something that Rachmaninoff did in the second piano concerto in the first movement, where also the first and second theme, you realize they belong together. And I mean, the piece was so well known in the 19th century, it's hardly imaginable that Rachmaninoff wouldn't have known that Mendelssohn did that sort of, had done this. But I mean, that's just sort of one instance, but the general idea of coherence, I think, is something where Mendelssohn was really a pioneer.
Yeah. Now, as you said, Mendelssohn was directing the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra at the time, and Ferdinand David was the leader of the orchestra, and it's dedicated at least to him. It's written in a kind of a collaboration. Was this kind of collaboration between leading soloists common in the 19th century, as opposed to earlier, perhaps with Mozart?
It depends. I mean, there are some very famous instances, and I mean, Mendelssohn and David were close personal friends. I mean, because David was leader of the Gewandhaus Orchestra, and Mendelssohn was a conductor. But David, they were childhood friends from their youth. So it wasn't like they'd met in Leipzig. It was actually that Mendelssohn had brought David to Leipzig, not with him, but sort of shortly after he'd arrived. So there was a natural. I mean, would have been natural for Mendelssohn to approach David and work with him on the violin part, because Mendelssohn was a very capable violinist, but I mean, he wasn't a violin virtuoso. So I mean, there were things that he could learn from David, and David was happy to share. Brahms and Joseph Joachim is another very quite famous example, where Joachim, really one of the greatest violinists of the 19th century, I mean, his part in writing the Brahms concerto, or helping Brahms write the Brahms concerto, was actually even bigger, because Brahms was very much a keyboard player. I mean, he didn't know very much about string playing and string technique at all. And so Brahms said, listen, I need help here. In many other instances, of course, composers simply wrote pieces for themselves. So they would have had this collaboration sort of within their own persons, which is perhaps the more common way of writing concertos in the 19th century.
Yeah, would you say that was a move more towards composers being pianists and travelling virtuosos like Beethoven, say, rather than instead of, let's say, the Baroque period, where I guess a lot of composers were violinists themselves? Is it reflecting in this shift of?
I never thought about it like that. I mean, there aren't really keyboard concertos before Bach, and Bach was a keyboard virtuoso. On the other hand, there are plenty of keyboard virtuosos in the 17th century that didn't write concertos for reasons best known to themselves. They wrote sort of solo music. I suppose, I mean, the underlying big important development is the development of the concert as a commercial venue from the late 18th century onwards. So all of a sudden, it's not about being at court and playing for your prince or your duke or whatever, maybe with a few invited guests, but it's actually making concert life a commercial enterprise. And so, of course, you have big halls, and you need to fill these big halls. And well, I mean, pianists. I mean, the people who are perhaps most apt to be most able to fill these big holes simply in terms of volume. I mean, the piano becomes a bigger instrument and becomes a more voluminous instrument. I mean, with all these things coming together, it's perhaps no accident or no complete accident that sort of from Mozart onwards, really, the piano virtuoso / composer becomes more the norm than the violinist / composer. The violinists tend to be only performers, or they're all performers who also compose a bit.
I was wondering, as an editor of Mendelssohn, having edited both the Italian and the Scottish symphonies, I wondered whether you've come across any difficulties in looking at the original manuscripts. Say with Beethoven sketches, Beethoven might have an idea in his head, and he'd have lots of pieces on, letters and things on the table, and he would just write across the page and not worry about which pieces of paper he'd go across. So it's always an issue with those. But anything?
It's not quite as messy as Beethoven, but nothing would be. The problem with Mendelssohn is that, there is this tendency to rework and rework and rework. But the problem with Mendelssohn is he doesn't do it in sketches. And I mean, with Beethoven, there's the standard threefold progression there. The sketches, there's the drafts, and then there's the full score. Mendelssohn normally starts with a full score, or he does some preliminary sketches, and then straight off he starts with a full score, and then all corrections are actually in the full score, which sometimes there's 2 or 3 layers, and he starts pasting over, he starts cutting out pages when he revises. So actually working out what's underneath and what's above can sometimes be quite difficult. His handwriting is neater than that by Beethoven, otherwise it would be completely hopeless.
Yeah. On the front of editing in general, with older types of music, like medieval music, where they're using different forms of notation, it's perhaps more obvious the need for current editions for us to perform the music. But with the later music, like Beethoven and Mendelssohn, principally what are you doing in terms of the edition process?
I mean, there are 2 things, really. I mean, one thing is actually uncovering all these preliminary stages. So, for example, with the Italian symphony, there's actually, there's the 4-movement version we know, but then Mendelssohn actually started a revision of that Italian symphony, and so there's movements 2, 3, 4. There's a second version, which was until about 15 years ago was completely unknown, and now that's I wasn't the one who discovered that, but that's now out, and so people can look at it and people can get the impression. It's like Bruckner, where you also have these different versions of the symphonies. And for the Scottish symphony, I actually did discover an earlier version of the Scottish symphony for the 1st and 4th movement. So that's the one thing. And the other thing is correcting errors, which aren't normally massive. But on the other hand, you do want to get it right. So if you have the first edition, which is usually what performances up to this very day are based on, they're usually sort of on every page there's 3, 4, 5 little errors. There's a slur in the wrong place or a slur missing. There's maybe sort of a note or 2 in the wrong place in a chord. It doesn't make the difference to the overall structure of the piece, but I suppose Mendelssohn did want to get it right. He was really, like I said, very focused on every little detail, and I think in a sense we owe it to Mendelssohn to abide by his wishes and actually get it right.
Both Mendelssohn's concerto and Beethoven Symphony that we'll be listening to this evening are massive figures in the repertoire, but what do you think makes them a good pairing? Do they have similarities, such as the innovative figures that we talked about before, sort of about in terms of their construction?
There is, of course, in the Beethoven 5, there is the same approach to linking the movements together. That you have the ba 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 that everybody knows, which actually appears in 3 or 4 movements. There is again the seamless transition from the 3rd to the 4th movement. It's probably fair to say that there's very little in Mendelssohn that isn't where the seeds aren't present in Beethoven already, and Mendelssohn was a big admirer of Beethoven's, and so for say for symphonies and concertos, and for large-scale orchestral music, Beethoven was his absolute model. And then he would try to take it one step further. And so when you look at, say, the Beethoven Violin Concerto, which has a lot, again, there's seeds of all these techniques in there, but it's a fairly standard three-movement form. And Mendelssohn takes that and just sort of brings it into the Romantic era. And so, Beethoven 5, I mean, E.T.A. Hoffmann, the German author, he said that Beethoven 5 is like the founding document of musical romanticism. So in that sense, it's very appropriate to have that. You should actually, in terms of understanding how it works, you should actually have the Beethoven first and the Mendelssohn second. However, I realize that within the constraints of programming, that's not easily done.
Join us again for our next pre-concert interview on Sunday the 12th of February with violinist Karine Makarova.
Watch out for more events and updates available on our website www.venuecymru.co.uk.